The title of this presentation suggests that we will be analyzing the history of the Battle of Midway from a pilot's perspective, perhaps for the first time in the 70 years since the battle. Consider the problems inherited by Admiral Chester Nimitz in May 1942 after he had assumed command at Pearl Harbor as SINCPAC. Outside his office, the sight and stench of death emanated from the sunken wrecks of our battleships. Himself a submarine warfare specialist, he had long considered the battleships to be our Navy's main offensive weapon. In January, the carrier Saratoga had been torpedoed and had to return to the West Coast for repairs. Our Navy had lost the carrier Lexington and the Battle of Coral Sea. The Yorktown, our other carrier in that battle, was damaged. In Washington, Admiral King was critical of Admiral Fletcher's conduct of the Coral Sea battle. Also in Washington, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill announced the Germany First policy, relegating Nimitz's Pacific War to a holding action, with limited call on the nation's resources. The press worried about possible Japanese strikes against Hawaii, the west coast of America, or the Panama Canal. What a load this was for a man to take up. What had prepared him, Admirals King, Towers, Spruance, Fletcher, McCain, and Halsey, and their staffs, to assume these heavy leadership responsibilities when their country needed them so desperately. Their naval careers had spanned peacetime years, when the military forces were ridiculed and maligned. Budgets were tight during the Depression years and advancement slow. Where did these persevering patriots come from? They were the product of disciplines and traditions that were first instilled in them at Annapolis and nurtured during years of sea duties, testing, staff work, and education. Their entire naval careers were a continuing selection process designed to weed out the weak and incompetent and to temper the strong. At that time, the Japanese had already advanced south and west through the South Pacific and Indian Oceans. In January, shortly after Pearl Harbor, Japanese land-based aircraft sank the British capital ships Prince of Wales and the Repulse up here in the China Sea. In February, Japanese carrier aircraft had taken a heavy toll of shipping in the harbor of Port Darwin, Australia. Also in February, the combined American, British, and Dutch Asiatic fleet of 9 cruisers and 18 destroyers was nearly annihilated here by the Japanese in the costly Battle of Java Sea, along with their old carrier, the Langley. During the first 2 weeks of April, Japan's force of 5 fleet carriers had effectively driven the Dutch, British, and American navies out of the Indian Ocean, sinking the British aircraft carrier Hermes and the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire. The Japanese carrier cruiser task force raided freely in the Bay of Bengal, striking the ports of Colombo and Trincomalee on Ceylon, sinking dozens of merchant ships and oil tankers. In India, the Nationalist Party was awaiting the opportunity to evict the British and welcome the Germans and the Japanese. The Japanese fleet moved as far west as Madagascar, which was in the hands of the Vichy French, who were cooperating with the Germans and the Japanese. The Japanese were threatening to sever vital Lend-Lease pipelines through the Indian Ocean to the British Army at Suez, to the Russians via Iran, and to China through the Burma Road. Southward, in the opposite direction, sailed the tankers carrying Mideast oil needed to feed America's war machines. Control of the Indian Ocean was important, with the Mediterranean closed by the Germans. These Lend-Lease routes were vital. Had the Japanese chosen to send an invasion force, they could have occupied Ceylon virtually unopposed. Believe me, these were desperate times in the Indian Ocean. The subject of German-Japanese plans to unite in the Middle East is too broad a subject for me to take up today. Let these few slides suffice. Also in February 1942, Hitler predicted, "The Japanese have recognized the great strategic importance of Madagascar for naval warfare. According to reports submitted, they are planning to establish bases on Madagascar, in addition to Ceylon, in order to cripple sea transportation in the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea." At an April 14, 1942, midnight meeting of the British Defense Committee, Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook spoke. If Japan's advance along the southern shores of Asia was not halted, it would cut off 750,000 fighting men in the Middle East and bring about the dreaded junction of the Axis partners. Turkey would be surrounded. The Russian oil supplies in the Caucasus would be threatened. After the war, Churchill was to call the prospect of a Japanese assault on Ceylon the most dangerous moment of the war. General Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps were sweeping across Libya, threatening the British Army defending Suez. There were 500,000 Jewish settlers in Palestine in 1942. But noble gas fans were to operate just behind Rommel's front line for the express purpose of killing Jews in occupied territory. Had the U.S. Navy lost the Battle of Midway, the state of Israel would have remained a dream. "What can we do to help?" President Roosevelt asked Churchill. "Give us as many tanks as you can spare," Churchill replied, "and ship them to the British forces in North Africa." At FDR's direction, 300 tanks were taken from the production line and redesigned for desert warfare. These, along with 100 self-propelled guns, were then sent to Suez via Lend-Lease through the Indian Ocean. The 300 Sherman tanks and 100 self-propelled guns sent by the United States were to be critical in the British victory over Rommel. The same Lend-Lease lifeline helped the Russians to hold Stalingrad. Meanwhile, far to the north in the Central Pacific, on April 18th, the United States Navy Task Force, centered on the carriers Hornet and Enterprise, launched Major Doolittle's Army B-25s to bomb Tokyo and Nagoya. Aboard the Enterprise was a 42-year-old naval aviator, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, an Annapolis graduate of 1926, who had devoted his life to the U.S. Navy. Never in their wildest imaginings could Churchill, General Auchinleck, Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Nagumo, General Rommel, and the German officers have conjured up the chain of events that caused the chaotic raid of Major Doolittle and the courage of men like Lieutenant Commander McCluskey to alter the course of history at the Battle of Midway. This seemingly chaotic raid on their homeland served its purpose. It persuaded the Japanese to advance Admiral Yamamoto's plan to invade Midway and to lure the remaining U.S. fleet out to a decisive battle. He was about to get his wish. For the invasion of Midway Atoll, the Japanese had spent months setting up an elaborate plan of operations involving 200 ships and 700 planes. They wargamed the plan aboard Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, the Yamato. But Admirals King and Nimitz had only 3 frantic weeks to make their plan, mobilize the fleet, and mount the operation. American cryptographers had broken the Japanese communications code and were well informed of the Japanese fleet's movements. A bold plan was initiated to risk our only remaining attack forces, the aircraft carriers, to carry out a devastating ambush of Japan's carriers, catching them by surprise as they were attacking Midway. If the Japanese carriers' flight decks could be put out of commission, the Japanese would be unable to launch a counterstrike on the American carriers. Once our aircraft came within striking range of the Japanese, survival of our carriers depended on incapacitating the flight decks of the 4 Japanese carriers with the surprise first strike. The officers who had commanded carriers during the fleet problems of the 1930s understood the risks and the importance of getting in the first blows. Failure would leave our carriers exposed to counterstrikes by the longer-range Japanese aircraft. As the ONI recorded, during the night of June 3rd, 4th, our task forces moved south-southwest to a position about 200 miles north of Midway. It was hoped that they would be able to catch the enemy striking force on the flank when it launched its anticipated attack on the islands. This map shows the Japanese carriers arriving from the northwest and our Navy's planned ambush station at dawn 200 miles north of Midway, with our fleet prepared to pounce on the Japanese carriers as their planes were occupied attacking the island of Midway. On confirmation of the Japanese presence, our task forces would close to within 120 miles of the Japanese, well within striking range for our fighters, torpedo planes, and dive bombers. Fully coordinated attacks by over 150 planes would overwhelm the Japanese defenders and immobilize all of their carriers before they could launch strikes back at our carriers. Nagumo's planes attacking Midway would have no place to land when they returned. But as late as 0900 that morning of June 4th, Admiral Fletcher's Task Force 17 was still 260 miles northeast of Midway. Shown are the actual launch times, 0700 for the Hornet and 0900 for the Yorktown. Note the 0917 change of course by the Japanese. The circle on this map indicates a 300-mile radius from Midway. The day before the battle, Japan's main carrier strike force is shown approaching Midway from the northwest, the occupation force from the southwest. The Japanese occupation force was first sighted on June 1st by a U.S. submarine. Then, on June 3rd, this invasion force was sighted by a PBY Catalina on routine patrol. This prompted the first offensive move by the defenders of Midway. At 0500 on the evening of June 3rd, 9 Army B-17s dropped bomb loads on this fleet from high altitude. No hits were scored. During the night of June 3rd, 3 PBYs made a bold moonlight torpedo attack, and 1 hit and damaged an oil tanker. This would prove to be the only successful torpedo strike of the entire 3-day battle. These sightings, originally reported as main body, plus the June 3rd report of Aleutian attacks, confirmed the accuracy of the codebreakers' predictions. All that remained was the arrival of the Japanese carrier fleet.
Pearl Harbor Admiral Nimitz responded to Ensign Reed's message of sighting the main body by sending a coded message to Admiral Fletcher. This is not, repeat not, the enemy striking force. Stop. This is the landing force. The striking force will hit from the northwest tomorrow.
Of course, that was a great feather in our cap. And Admiral Nimitz made the comment to Commander Layton at that time. He said, "You were 5 miles and 5 minutes off in your projection." But the orders to Admiral Fletcher and Admiral Halsey were not to launch any aircraft or any searches against the Japanese fleet or any attacks until we had had an attack on Midway.
Instead of remaining poised to pounce southward on the Japanese carriers, Admiral Fletcher abandoned the dawn ambush station to cautiously mount defensive searches immediately to his north. At 04:30, as the Japanese were launching their attack on Midway, Yorktown had begun launching 6 Wildcats for a CAP and 9 SBD scout planes to search 100 miles of open sea to the north of Task Force 17. A light 4-knot wind required a 28-knot speed from the carrier to gain enough wind across the deck for launching. This meant that the American carriers were racing southeastward at high speed, away from the ambush station, 200 miles north of Midway. At 0600, Task Force 16 with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet was belatedly dispatched to proceed southwest at high speed and then attempt to move closer to the Japanese carriers pounding Midway, while the Yorktown continued east to recover Fletcher's dawn search planes at 0630. Discovery of the Japanese carrier fleet came with radio reports from the PBY search planes of Lieutenant Howard Addy between 0503 and 0540. It was confirmed by the Catalina of Lieutenant William Chase at 0544 that morning. Many planes heading Midway. Here are scenes of a Japanese dawn launch. All Midway land-based planes were promptly launched. Brewster Buffalo and Grumman Wildcats, assigned to defend the island, were quickly overcome by the Zeros. At 0700, as Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet were charging to the east away from the enemy, the first of these Midway defenders found and attacked the Japanese carriers. There were 6 Navy TBFs and 4 Army B-26s rigged to carry torpedoes. 9 Flying Fortresses then dropped bombs from high altitude. Next were 11 Marine SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers and 16 Marine Dauntless SBDs. Major Lofton Henderson led this flight in a glide bombing run because his young pilots were not trained as dive bombers. All of these separate land-based forces, Army Air Force, Navy, and the Marines, navigating independently, did a fine job of finding the Japanese carriers on the open sea 135 miles northwest of Midway. They were all repulsed with catastrophic losses. Not a single hit was scored. The few planes that returned to Midway were shot to ribbons, most no longer serviceable. The islands of Midway were in flames. Having beaten off all these attacks, at 0905, Admiral Nagumo signaled, "Proceed northward after recovering planes. We plan to contact and destroy enemy task forces." The Quito Butai had started recovering the Midway strike planes at 0837. The opportunity to implement our Navy's ambush had been lost, as well as the element of surprise. Although still at extreme range for our aircraft, Admiral Spruance decided at 0700 to begin launching his attack. At the very time land-based planes from Midway were being crushed by the Japanese, the first of our carrier planes were just being launched. They were beyond effective range and they were too late. By the time Commander Ring reached the expected target area, the Japanese had moved on. They may have been just over the horizon, but he had no fuel left for a search. The F-4F fighter planes ran out of fuel and tried to return to the Hornet. The entire squadron was lost at sea, but some pilots were later recovered. Hornet's dive bombers, running short of fuel, turned back or headed to Midway, where they landed or ditched at sea. During the entire morning, the only Hornet planes to engage the Japanese carriers were the doomed Torpedo Squadron 8. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron broke away from his group leader and led the 15 planes of Torpedo Squadron 8 to its destruction at 0930. As Kito Butai then ran northeast, they left behind one survivor, Ensign George Gay, clinging to a seat cushion in the sea. Not likely that Gay witnessed the attack of the dive bombers, or that the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 influenced positioning of the Zero defenders when the dive bombers attacked almost an hour later. The Enterprise began launching Commander McCluskey's VS-6 and VB-6 about the same time as the Hornet's ill-fated air group. Impatient with the slow pace of launching into the 4-knot wind, Admiral Spruance at 7:52 wisely instructed McCluskey to proceed with his 33 dive bombers without waiting for the torpedo planes and fighter escort. Again, the Japanese carriers were no longer at the estimated target location, although the Midway-based inexperienced navigators of the Army, Marines, Navy, and Air Force had all found the Japanese carriers at sea that morning. The experienced carrier pilots were having difficulty. Although McCluskey was at the point of no return, meaning his squadron did not have enough fuel to return to the Enterprise, he initiated a square search. On the second leg, he spotted a Japanese destroyer headed northeast at high speed. Wisely he followed, and it led him to the Japanese fleet. He started a high-speed run-in to the most advantageous attack position for his squadron, targeting the Kaga and the Akagi. Let's leave them here, poised to attack, as we follow the Yorktown group. At 0900, the Yorktown launched 17 dive bombers of BB-3, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, 12 torpedo planes, and only 6 fighters for escort. Admiral Fletcher held back half of his bombing strike force and 2/3 of his fighters as a defensive measure. Since the Japanese had turned northeast at 9:17, they closed the range between the two forces, and the Yorktown planes reached the target fleet in good order. However, only 4 torpedo planes survived the attack, and no hits were scored. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch and his F-4Fs engaged the Zeros, and 2 of his 6 were lost. During the entire day-long battle, of 79 F-4F fighter planes embarked on our 3 carriers. Only these 6 fighters from the Yorktown reached the Japanese carriers and managed to engage in combat. At 10:20, only Max Leslie and his 17 dive bombers remained uncommitted of the Yorktown group. He entered his high-speed run-in to position his pilots over the Japanese carrier Suryu. So Max Leslie and 17 dive bombers from the Yorktown had arrived over the Japanese carriers at the same time as Wade McCluskey and 32 bombers from the Enterprise. It was now 10:22, 3 hours after the attack of the Midway land-based forces, and almost an hour after the first carrier plane attack by Torpedo Squadron 8. At this time, the Japanese were jubilant. Admiral Nagumo's forces had repulsed 9 separate American attacks without suffering any damage. Midway was in flames, and his strike force recovered. The invasion fleet was untouched, coming in from the west with the landing troops. Nagumo was closing in on the American carriers with overwhelming power. Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet were practically defenseless by this time, with their air groups decimated. High overhead, 2 Annapolis 1926 classmates were about to reunite and smash the Japanese carriers. At this time, Wade McCluskey was 42 years old, considered too old by Halsey to be flying fighter planes. He led his Enterprise group in from the southwest, targeting Kaga and Akagi, as Max Leslie came in from the northeast with the Yorktown dive bombers targeting Soryu. Faulty arming switches caused Leslie and 3 of his squadron to jettison their bombs prematurely. This further reduced Admiral Fletcher's strike force from the Yorktown to just 13 potent dive bombers.
While the Japanese were occupied with attacking Midway, the U.S. launched its strike force from the Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown. The mission was simple but daunting: locate and destroy the Japanese fleet. Time was also running out for the SBD dive bombers from the USS Enterprise. Already en route to the Japanese carriers, all 33 planes were ordered to proceed without waiting for fighter escort. When the SBDs arrived from the Enterprise and Yorktown, the Japanese carriers were floating powder kegs. The flight decks and hangars were packed with fully fueled and armed Zeros and bombers awaiting launch. In their haste to get the planes off to Midway, ordnance and open fuel lines were carelessly strewn about. So when the bombs from the SBDs landed, the result was a fiery disaster. Massive explosions rocked the carriers, setting them ablaze and sending chunks of the flight deck and whole airplanes into the sea. In all of 6 minutes, Japan would lose 3 of its 4 carriers at the battle.
In 6 minutes, what had promised to be a magnificent victory for Admiral Nagumo turned into the worst disaster the Japanese Navy had suffered in 350 years. After attacking Kaga, McCluskey was jumped by 2 Zeros as he pulled out of his dive low over the water. For 5 minutes, the Zeros alternated, making gunnery runs on the SBD, until Walter Chakasalusek, his gunner, shot down one and the other quit. The cockpit controls were shot up, and McCluskey took a bullet through his shoulder. Still, he managed to land safely. The SBD had 52 holes in it. Max Leslie ran out of fuel as he reached the Yorktown and made a successful water landing next to the cruiser Astoria. He ran out of fuel because he had doubled back, trying to lead a destroyer to the spot where his wingman had ditched. More than half the dive bombers failed to return. No one knows How many were shot down by the Japanese, or how many were simply lost at sea for lack of fuel? A division of the VS-6, led by Lieutenant Charles R. Ware, attacked the Kaga. Ware has successfully led his charges through fighter attacks after bombing Kaga, only to run out of fuel and perish with the entire division in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Only Ensign McCarthy and his gunner Howell ever found their way back, ditching near the U.S. fleet. Ensign Frank O'Flaherty and his gunner Bruno Gaido were picked up by the Japanese destroyer Makigumo, interrogated, and ultimately executed. History has paid little attention to the victorious sacrifice of the gallant dive bombers. Media attention is still focused on Torpedo Squadron 8. The Japanese carrier Hiryu had escaped the morning disaster, and Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi wanted revenge. At 10:45, he launched a strike against the American carriers, consisting of 18 Aval dive bombers and 6 Zeros. Those were to be followed by 8 torpedo planes and 3 Zeros as soon as they were rearmed. The American ships had radar, and a cordon of 14 Yorktown F-4Fs was vectored out to meet the incoming raid. These were the fighters Admiral Fletcher had held in reserve from the morning strike. Picked up on radar 32 miles out, the Japanese dive bombers fought a running battle with the Yorktown's defenders. Only 7 made it through the cordon and tipped over into their dives at 12:10. These 7 managed to make 3 bomb hits on the Yorktown, which brought it to a standstill. Dive bombers were also an effective weapon for the Japanese. Hiryu's second strike of 9 torpedo planes was launched at 13:31. Again intercepted en route, the Japanese pilots managed to strike the Yorktown with 2 of their powerful torpedoes, which basically finished off the Yorktown. Admiral Fletcher had transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria, and at 1800 that evening turned tactical command of the American fleet over to Admiral Spruance. That afternoon, of all the planes with which our Navy had started the day, only a mixed squadron of 25 bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were available for the final attack on Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier. Unescorted by fighters, the dive bombers finished off the Hiryu with the loss of only 3 planes, despite being intercepted at high altitude and harassed by the Japanese Zeros before, during, and after their dives. This adds another fact that negates the myth that the dive bombers succeeded in the morning only as a result of the diversion caused by the torpedo planes. 14 dive bombers from the Hornet arrived too late to attack the Hiryu and diverted 2 ships of the screen. Of 223 aircraft of all types embarked on our 3 American carriers, and 114 land-based on Midway Atoll, only the Enterprise and Yorktown Dauntless dive bombers inflicted any damage on the 4 Japanese carriers, and that damage was enough to save the day for Admiral Nimitz. The Japanese invasion force withdrew, and Yamamoto's main battle group retreated all the way back to Japan. Never again did the Japanese task forces threaten the vital Lend-Lease lifelines through the Indian Ocean. Later that year, the British held at El Alamein and the Russians at Stalingrad. The mantle of victory for the Battle of Midway was awarded Admirals Nimitz and Spruance, who carried on to see the war to its successful conclusion. Media attention was focused on Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, Ensign George Gay, and the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8. There was Ensign Gay, who appeared on the cover of Life magazine. This feature made no mention of the dive bombers. In September, 3 months after the battle, Admiral Fletcher was transferred, being placed in command of the Northwest Sea Frontier, based in Seattle, Washington. That same month of September, 3 months after the battle, Admiral John Towers was transferred to Admiral Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor as Com Air Pac. Admiral Towers was a pioneer naval aviator who had participated in the development of aircraft carriers and took part in every fleet exercise involving carrier and task force tactics since 1926. His career had been a dogged battle to win acceptance for aviation from a Navy that had been dominated by battleship admirals. Although he and Admiral Nimitz had been pre-war adversaries, Nimitz could no longer deny the need for his expertise. In the 1950s, 10 years after the Battle of Midway, the TV documentary films Crusade in the Pacific and Victory at Sea continued to show the sinking of the Japanese carriers at Midway by torpedo bombers. Here are clips from Victory at Sea showing all 4 of Japan's carriers being sunk by torpedo bombers.
Akagi, smashed and sinking. Kaga, smashed and sinking. Soryu, smashed and sinking. Kiryu, smashed and sinking. 4 Japanese carriers gone, and with them their irreplaceable pilots.
The dive bomber was the predecessor of today's guided missile. Pilots were programmed in the ready room aboard the carrier. Planes were catapulted from the deck and directed over sea and land to targets. Once over the target, the pilot tipped over from 10,000 feet and visually locked in on the target. At 300 knots, the 2-mile dive took 30 seconds, with the image of the target growing ever larger in the windscreen. As the war progressed, bombs were released at 1,000 feet or less before pulling out. At 500 feet per second, this was only 2 seconds before impact. In other words, the only difference between the Navy's World War II dive bomber and the Tomahawk missile was these 2 seconds. The only difference between our Navy's dive bombers and the Japanese kamikaze were these same 2 seconds. Note the unique split-wing dive flaps. The yoke holding the bomb was necessary in a vertical dive. On release, it swings out to prevent the bomb from hitting the propeller. This diagram summarizes the dive bomber as a weapon, but it is a scant way of illustrating what is a complicated and visually compelling series of actions. Usually misunderstood is the fact that in most cases the aircraft was vertical, with the pilot looking straight down, hanging from his shoulder straps. The 70-degree flight path was the result of lift on the wings. Wouldn't a 3D or IMAX film about dive bombers be great? In 1976, 34 years after the Battle of Midway, the Hollywood film Midway, for the first time, accurately depicted the dive bombers sinking the 4 Japanese carriers and dramatized the roles of Lieutenant Commander McCluskey and Leslie. This section of the film was well done. Wade McCluskey died that same year without seeing himself immortalized on the big screen. Now another 34 years has passed. The old Midway film has served the Navy well and has been a steady earner for Universal Films. With today's Navy facing reduced military budgets in the years ahead, a new film about the Battle of Midway might be timely. Fresh perspectives of the battle and properly planned plots and subplots can be created to anticipate now the Navy's projected challenges of the next 10 years. Wouldn't dive bombing be great in 3D or IMAX? Thank you for listening to my pilot's perspective on the Battle of Midway. I hope you enjoyed it. I did.